Good evening. I'm Dr. Sarah Gould, and I'd like to welcome you to another edition of our MACRI Talks. Tonight, we're joined by Dr. Marisela Martinez Cola, who is here to share with us the bricks before Brown v. Board of Education, discussing lesser-known school desegregation court cases involving Mexican American, Native American, and Chinese American families that preceded Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Tonight's MACRI Talk is part of our special semi-quincentennial series exploring what does the semi-quincentennial mean to Mexican Americans. Welcome, Dr. Martinez Cola. I want to tell everyone a little bit more about you before we get started. Dr. Martinez Cola is a proud Chicana, daughter of an immigrant and first-generation scholar. She was born and raised in Battle Creek, Michigan. She attended the University of Michigan, where she earned her bachelor's degree in psychology and African American studies. She went on to earn her law degree at Loyola University Chicago School of Law. While she loved studying law, the practice of law was a little unfulfilling, and so only a year into law, she switched career paths and served as the Director of Multicultural Affairs at several different institutions around the country. After about a decade, she transitioned and went on to earn a PhD in sociology at Emory University. Following her graduation, she joined Utah State University and now Morehouse College, where she currently serves as the director of the Institute for Social Justice Research and Policy in the Andrew Young Center for Global Leadership. She supports colleagues' research and writing and engages in meaningful public policy conversations. She is the author of The Bricks Before Brown, the Chinese American, Native American, and Mexican American Struggle for Educational Equality. Welcome, Dr. Martinez Cola.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for inviting me and asking me to be able to really honestly share my heart in speaking about this book that I wrote, The Bricks Before Brown. So I am really pleased and eager to share this information, and I hope that people can walk away having learned more that they can maybe not just be able to store in their mind, but also hopefully store in your hearts as well.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to put your presentation up and I'm going to be behind the scenes. So folks, if you have questions for Dr. Martinez Cola, put those in the chat and we'll get to them at the end.
Okay. So I should also say, by the way, to mention early morning from Jaipur, India. So I am in India right now. And good evening to you all there. And so this is really exciting for me to be able to share this even from nearly halfway across the world. Okay. One of the things that I like to do, oops, here we go. I don't know, it's not advancing for me. Is it advancing on your end? I can't hear you.
I'm so sorry. Here you go. Is this the correct slide? Are you able to see this? Apologies, we seem to be having some technical difficulties.
I can't hear you, Dr. Gould.
Okay, let's see. Can you hear me now? No? This is the first time we've had a guest who is in another country at the same time that we're doing this, so we might be having a little lag. Okay, it looks like we're having a little trouble advancing the slides, so I'm just going to help Dr. Martinez-Cola with that.
Oh, there we are. Okay. One moment. Okay, wonderful. So we'll just get started. So what I like to do whenever I share with my students is I always like to give an agenda. You know, I like to know, where are we going today? And so the slide that we should be on now is one that says agenda. And so we're going to have brief introduction. I'm going to talk about the book's background. Then we'll talk about chapter 1, laying the foundation. Chapter 2, the research that I did before discovering the discovering the 3 cases that we're discussing, and a Q&A. So here we are. All right. And now I'm on slide 3 and on to 4. Yes. So give you a little bit about myself. I am as I explained, I'm a first-generation scholar. And so I was born and raised in Battle Creek, Michigan, of all places. And that is called the cereal capital of the world. So that's Kellogg's is headquartered there. And so I often tell my students that I am the original frosted mini wheat, fun on one side, serious on the other. I am the eldest of 3 daughters. My mother is from Reynosa, Mexico, and my father is from Dana, Texas. And I joke around that they either really love cereal or they threw a dart to somehow figure out how to get to Battle Creek, Michigan. But I learned very early on the importance of education. You know, as I said, my mother had a 2nd grade education. My dad had an 8th grade education, but they're 2 of the smartest people I've ever known. And one of the smartest decisions they ever made was to make a really serious investment in our education. And so I ended up going to the University of Michigan for my undergrad. And when I was there, I went there under, when affirmative action, was really in full swing. And, was often told that the reason why I got into Michigan was because I was Hispanic, is what everybody would tell me. And I realized, that I used to walk around there feeling like so grateful that Michigan let me in, until I had a colleague, a mentor really, sit me down and say, Marisela, where else were you accepted? What other colleges were you accepted at? And I gave her the list of all the other colleges where I was accepted. And she said, you were accepted at those colleges. You could have gone anywhere else, but you decided to come to Michigan. And coming to Michigan, because you're here, makes Michigan a better place. And after she said that, I owned that campus. There was nothing else you could tell me otherwise. And so one of the things that you're supposed to do when you're a first-generation scholar is you're supposed to either go to medical school, law school, engineering, or business school. Those are one of the 4 things you're supposed to do, right? And I forgot, I stink at math and science. So that knocked 3 out right away. There was no way I was going to be able to go into those. But I could argue well and could speak. And so people said, you should go to law school. So sure enough, I ended up going to law school at Loyola University, Chicago, and loved the study of law, hated the practice of it, and ended up working in multicultural affairs, as we shared, at a variety of institutions, from George Washington University to Davenport University to the University of Georgia, and loved the work that I was doing, but realized that I enjoyed guest lecturing in the classroom, and I thought, I really want to teach. And in order for me to teach at a university, I needed to get a PhD because my JD wasn't enough. And so when my son went to school, we told him, my late husband and I told him, Mama's going back to school. And so it was really funny to go back to school with with my son. And so as he progressed in his education, I progressed in mine, and it took me 6 years to complete my PhD, which is a pretty standard time to do it. But I knew right away what I wanted to study. I knew that I wanted to study these particular cases, and I'll talk about, how I found them and how I sort of met the plaintiffs in these cases. And that's really kind of rare to go into grad school and know exactly what you want to study and then leave with the exact same topic that you studied with. You can come in with an idea and then you end up graduating with a totally different one. And I came in knowing exactly what I wanted to study and leaving having written my dissertation on that. And so I was there at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. That's where I live now. Went to work at Utah State University, of all places, Utah, which was really really fascinating. And then, my dream job, however, was to work at Morehouse College. When I was in grad school, I did a fellowship there and ended up falling in love. And I was like, I don't know when, I don't know how, but somehow I need to end up back at Morehouse College. And for those of you who may not know, Morehouse College is a historically Black college for people who identify as men. So it's a young men's college. And I absolutely love it there and am completely and utterly fulfilled. And so I share that also to let people know it's never too late. I started my PhD journey in my 40s, and now I'm in my 50s and finally doing what I really love to do. And I share with people that I went to the University of Michigan to celebrate my community. Then I went to Loyola University to celebrate my family. But going to Emory and getting my PhD, that was all mine. That's what I really wanted to do. And so it's never too late, just as an FYI. So moving on to the next slide. As I said, giving a little bit of background of the book. When you think about, and I'm on slide 6, when you think about segregation, what do you think about? And I'm sharing here some photographs that when I just Googled the phrase school desegregation, these kinds of images popped up. They are literally black and white photos, but they're also really indicative of the way that the story is told in what we call a black and white binary, right? That very much that this was an issue that African Americans faced and faced solely. And you don't really know or get to hear about what happened before this looked. And so one of the things that I did, and we're in slide 7, is that we learned that segregation is limited to the 1950s. That's where people think. That is located in the South, people associate it within the South. And then it's a division between black and white. That's what you learn. And most people learn about school desegregation in the US if it's taught at all, right? In slide 8, the biggest case that most people know about or have heard is Brown v. Board of Education. And in Brown v. Board of Education, it was actually one of 5 cases that ended up going to the Supreme Court. But the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall selected the Brown family to be the main family representing the case because, Oliver Brown he was a pastor, and he also was a man that worked in a union job. And so there was a tremendous amount of respect for that and the work that he did. And also, we'll talk about this too, she was she was the only child that had both parents present, and that they were also middle class was another thing, and we'll talk about that as well. And so you learn about Brown v. Board of Education as the main case. So in slide 9. So one of the things that I thought about, however, right, when you talk about segregation, it begins in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson, where they allowed segregation to exist and created that doctrine called separate but equal, saying we'll keep everything separate as long as it's equal. So you will have your own, place to sit on the bus, and white people will have their only place to sit on the bus. And we're provided that the accommodations are equal, we're good. And then in schools, they said, we're going to keep separate schools. So there will be black schools and there will be white schools. And those can exist so long as they're equal in every other sense. And of course, we learn, right, that there was nothing equal about being separate. And then you learn, of course, in 1954 is when that battle was fought, or the way that it's taught is when it was fought. But I sat and I thought about what happened to, were there any Chinese Americans? Were there any Asian Americans that had this battle? Were there any Native Americans that had this battle? You know, what happened in between that time? Were there any Mexican Americans that were involved in this battle? And, you know, I knew law and I knew how law worked. And whenever there's a case, other people feel like they feel like they're raising their hand saying, please include us too. We're also a part of this. And so I expected to find cases around 1954 when I thought about what happened between 1896 and 1954, and found some really incredible, some really interesting information that I will be sharing with you shortly. So we're now on slide 10. So chapter 1 is what I call laying the foundation. And this is something that, in order to really understand the story, the school desegregation, the long civil rights history is what they call it, there's some things that you sort of need to understand. On slide 11. And so one of the things that I discuss in that first chapter is one thing that I call Black foundationalism. And that really comes from the idea that there were many Black scholars that came before who really helped to lay a foundation of what it means to study your own people, what it means to study your own history. One of the things that I had a wonderful, professor at Michigan, and I majored in African Studies, and his name was Dr. Earl Lewis. And Dr. Lewis said, Maricela, history is about whose story is being told. So history is really whose story, and you need to be able to understand where that comes from. And so there's several books that come out, shortly after, well, throughout history, but definitely as more and more scholars and Black historians and Black scholars were developed, that came to really lay a foundation. And one of the foundations they laid was in critical race theory. Now, critical race theory was actually a very multicultural movement. It wasn't just Black scholars that did it. However, Black scholars are largely credited for it. But there were Native American scholars that contributed to it, Latine, Mexican American scholars that contributed to it, Asian American scholars that contributed to it. And so what ended up happening is what I call branches. Branches began to grow from critical race theory. And so you have Latino critical race theory, Desi critical race theory, that's about Indian critical race theory, meaning from India, Indian, discrit, disability, multiracial crit, queer crit, tribal crit for Native Americans, and Asian crit for Asian Americans. And so really the story, a fuller story begins to be told. And so moving to slide 12. So one of the things that I did in this book and that I do is I take the tenets of each of those theories, critical race theory, Latino critical race theory, and Asian American critical race theory, and tribal crit theory, and I put them side by side for people to be able to see what are the similarities across the groups, what are the differences. One of the things that I am proud of to be as a scholar is I try to build bridges between communities whenever possible. And so this is, my book is one of the first ones to put them side by side in this particular manner. There's lots of books about them separately, but I really wanted to try to find a way to bring them together in a meaningful way. And here's some other things in slide 13. You learn that there are different, the different founding authors of all the different theories. What are some of the significant cases that are involved in them? What are some of the treaties and the civil rights legislation that exist? Who are the civil rights organizations involved? And what are some of the unique issues? So you know that the impact of slavery is going to be a very unique issue within Black communities. But one of the things that is important in, for example, Lat Crit and Tribal Crit is the role of colonization to those communities. The idea that, race versus ethnicity when you talk about Latinos in the United States. Asian Americans, the unique cost to them, one of the unique, issues related to their communities is this idea of the model minority myth. that, Asian Americans are, these extraordinarily successful, good at math, good at, just all those, that are out there they become a monolith rather than understanding there's a lot of diversity within, the Asian American community, as there is in the Latino, community. And of course you have tribal crit, which, really you're looking at, colonization. You're looking at the idea that there's this idea of a blood quantum, like who gets to be Native American, and there's percentages related to it, or whether or not your mother is. And so those are really unique. But then there's some stuff that the four of them share together. And they talk about the idea they all share is that race is a social construct. And I don't really have time to get into that, but it's basically race is something that society created. It didn't ever really exist until society said it was a thing. They discuss the idea that there's a lot of intersectional aspects, and we'll talk about, what are the ways that different things intersect. Like, it's not just about race, it's about class, it's about age, it's about gender. When you try to put them sort of all together, think of them as an intersection, a road intersection where all these different roads are coming together to a central point. They love, one of the big things is reconstructing narratives. And it's going back to the idea that there's whose history is being told. And there's storytelling and a commitment to social justice and a really intense connection between race and labor. All four really discover that and explain that. It's really exciting when you decide to see them side by side and to really be able to look at not just the critical connections, which is what I call them, between the groups, but the meaningful differences that exist. On the next slide, one of the other things I talk about are something called controlling images. And when you think about controlling images, I want you to think about stereotypes, right? So what are the stereotypes that exist out there, particularly about women in these communities, right? And I discussed that there are sort of two aspects. One aspect, either Asian American women, Native American women, and Mexican American women are either criminalized or sexualized into these, and I put them as pagans and prostitutes. With Asian Americans, that's how they're seen as, sort of people that are godless, or the Chinese prostitutes that happened in the late 1800s, where the images that were going on at that time, squaw and savages was a really big stereotypes around, Native American women, and what I call malinches and mamacitas with Mexican Americans. And on the other side of that, you had, pathetic and inferior controlling images. And so Asian Americans were often cast as sort of these poor creatures that existed in these areas. Native Americans were often seen as a sacrificial maiden. There were all these, if you look at some of the literature around the time that this case has happened, when I'll be talking about soon, there was always a story where a Native American, maiden ends up dying in the story because she has given up her culture and, and becomes sort of this idea that this is what happens if you don't, this can possibly happen when you end up sort of losing your culture and moving over to an identity. And so they end up sort of saying that, this poor girl who tried to assimilate ends up dying, and so it's a really, really fascinating story. You can actually see it in a lot of Westerns too. There inevitably will be some, a Native American woman who will be harmed or hurt or die in a lot of these films. And then, Mexican Americans were cast as mentally inferior. And so one of the things about these cases, and you're going to learn, they happen throughout history. They didn't just happen around 1954 like I thought. It started in the early 1800s with Chinese Americans. Then it went on to the 1920s with Native Americans, and then the 1940s with Mexican Americans. And one of the things that I argue is the plaintiffs in these cases were too middle class to be considered pathetic or inferior, but they were also too young to be criminalized and sexualized. So they were sort of in the middle there, where they could not necessarily be, a controlling image could not be cast upon them as they did these cases. So I hope that kind of makes a little sense. So that is the first chapter. And so that lays the foundation. I probably spent a little bit too much time on that, but that's okay. Chapter 2 is about what did I find when I started to look before Brown. And in the slide 16, you're able to see that I identified over 105 cases that were filed before Brown v. Board of Education. And the first one was filed in 1849 in Boston, Massachusetts. And this map shows not only that it was in 1849, so remember how I said that people think it's limited to the 50s? That showed, and my research showed that no, it's gone throughout history. And remember how I said that it's also limited to the South? This map shows you that yes, a lot of cases occurred in the South, but they also happen in the Midwest, in the Northeast, and out in the West. And more so in 17, you get to see the geographic distribution. And in the book, I lay out all the different cases that were on there, and I discuss sort of, what they look like. In 18, slide 18, you can see what the cases in the South, and 19, here are the cases in the West and the Midwest. And one of the things I always like to show, to kind of point out, is to look at Kansas. Kansas has 10 cases involved in just Kansas alone. And one of the things that it's in the back of my file cabinet is to figure out what's going on in Kansas, what's so special about Kansas. And people say, well, Kansas is where Brown happened. Well, that's not really the case, because as you can see from this, the cases started very early in the 1800s. And then, of course, you have California that had 7 cases. That's the next biggest one. And California is really where the story is told. We move on to chapter 3, 4, and 5. And this is the part that I really honestly love to talk about. So the first case that I like to share on slide 21 is Tate versus Hurley. And so this is a family in 1885. You have Joseph Tate and Mary Tate and their 3 children, Elizabeth, Mamie, and Frank. And the young girl in the middle of this family photograph is Mamie Tate. And she ends up being the lead plaintiff. And so what happens is the Tate family is a fairly wealthy family because they're able to work in a segregated environment between, they're able to bridge the Chinese communities to white communities by being, they call them a drayman, which is a deliverer. They delivered things. And also sort of, they owned a store where they were able to send telegraphs and things like that. And they were bilingual. And so they were able to act as translators. So Joseph Tate, for example, was a translator for the embassy, for an embassy in California. And so he tried to enroll his daughter in the school closest to their home. This is also what happened in Brown. And so Mamie and her father end up going to the school. They are brutally rejected and told, you cannot stay here, and told that you need to go someplace else. You can't go here. Well, the issue was Chinese schools didn't necessarily exist at the time. So there was no other school for her to go to. There was no separate, but equal. And so they fought and fought to get into the school, and they actually won. She won the right to go into the white school. However, what happened in the interim, they kept delaying her admission for a variety of reasons, saying that she was diseased, that she was filthy, that she couldn't interact with and belong, and is going to harm white students. And the judge in the case said, according to the law, the way that it's written in California right now, you have to let her in, because the law is written that all children are allowed to go to public school. However, wink, wink, he gives in the opinion, if you were to get the law changed, then you can do whatever you'd like. But right now, my hands are tied by the law. And so, again, they delayed her admission until they were able to go to the legislature. And the legislature then created the ability to be able to create separate schools. And they created a separate Chinese school for just 6 children. And 2 of them were Frank and Mamie, Mamie and her brother Frank. And so, they end up, being forced to go to the Chinese school. And there's a really wonderful description of her first day of school, and she's dressed beautifully. And they describe her this wonderful hat she's wearing with a plume, a feather, and beautiful dress and white tights. And I sit there and I imagine her mother dressing her that day, knowing her child was going to be on display, knowing that reporters were going to be there reporting about the opening of the Chinese school, and they were finally be able to kind of give a place for all these Chinese children to go to. And there was another thing that I found in this that I thought was so powerful. Mary Tape, the mother, ended up penning and writing a letter to the editorial of the local newspaper that ended up being sent to all the different newspapers. And it's this fiery letter that she's writing to the school board, telling them, how dare you reject my child? You know, my child is just as good as your child. She has played with white children since she was young. She knows how to, she can speak as well as the children. She and deserves and has this right. And what was so remarkable about it is it just gave me chills as a mother myself. She's fighting for her daughter. And she calls out the white men that are on the school board and says, you are race prejudiced men, calls them racist, and says, how dare you do this? And you have to understand how remarkable this is for a Chinese woman to voice herself, to write so powerfully in this moment. It's the Mary Tape letter, and it's often called the Chinese mother's letter. And I remember, I always tell my students that you have to have a goosebump moment when you're researching. You're gonna have one where you just get these goosebumps. And I got it that time when I found and discovered this letter. It's a beautiful letter that I hope if you do read my book, you get a chance to read. It's extraordinarily powerful. So you fast forward, slide 22, to Piper versus Big Pine. And this happened in 1924, also in California. These are all California cases. And Alice Piper, again, the story is going to sound very familiar, wanted to go. They promised, there was a white school that was built, and then there were Indian schools at the time, and not Indian boarding schools. Those are different. There was Indian schools, separate Indian schools that existed. But they were building a new school, and the school board, the white school board, promised that they would let Native American children attend the schools. Well, once the school was built, they went back on their promise. And they said, no, you have to keep going and stay with the Indian schools. And so Alice Piper and her father, again, attempted to enroll Alice in the school, and they were brutally rejected. And it was Alice and about, I believe, five young men who were also part of the lawsuit, but she became the main lead plaintiff. And so they sue the school and end up, of course, then winning the case. And one of the really powerful sort of moments for me as a researcher in this, they win the case, the children end up going to school, and there's a photograph of Alice that is just, if you look at this rendering, this picture, the only photograph that many people had was just of her face, you know, with her hair swept to the side. That was the only photograph I had known of Alice while I was researching her. And so they ended up, you know, we'll talk about the statue in a minute. But as I went to Big Pine to interview the people that were close to this case, one of the things they showed me was this collage of photographs of Alice. And they show me this collage of photographs, and I look and I see, and I was like, oh my goodness, this picture of an older woman. And I can see young Alice's face. And I said, is that Alice Piper? And they said, yeah, that's her as an adult. And there were all these photographs of her as an adult. And again, I had this beautiful research bump moment where I got to see this child grown up and see, you know, what is it that she got to do after she, you know, graduated from high school, which was, again, very rare for young Native American women to do that. And this school case was an elementary school, so she got a chance to go all the way through to graduation, and she became a matron, a school matron for a Native American boarding school in Nevada. But I looked at her picture and I actually started crying to be able to see Alice grown up. And, you know, she ended up passing away with a lot of people not knowing her story. And so there's a second beautiful story to this, to Alice's contribution, in that in the, you know, late 2000s, you know, the community, the Big Pine community, said, we need to do something special to honor her contributions to school desegregation. And so they had an artist, a Native American artist, render what would she have looked at as a young Paiute girl. And so they end up drawing this picture of her holding books, and they created a life-size statue of Alice Piper. The community brought together, they got all these you know, donors to come and give, and there's this gorgeous, beautiful, full life-size statue, one of the few statues that exist dedicated to school desegregation across the country. And so you get a chance to see Alice, and it's a beautiful, beautiful statue. And, I'm so grateful that I got an opportunity to see it. And I have a little mini statue of it. It's called a macat in my office that gives me tremendous joy every time I get a chance to look at it. And finally, we have Mendez v. Westminster. You fast forward to 1947, and here you have Sylvia Mendez. And again, the story is going to sound very familiar. There are Mexican schools and white schools. And so even though the Alice Piper case said they were not allowed to have separate Indian schools, the way that the law was working is that, well, just because it said you couldn't do it with Indian schools, doesn't mean that it can't happen with Mexican schools. And so they end up creating Mexican schools. And so they try to enroll Sylvia into the school closest to their home, and end up getting Sylvia and her two siblings. And they went in, her aunt actually went in. It wasn't her father that took her, which is interesting. That's a diversion from the stories. It was always the father that went in. And this was the first time an aunt went in. And she took their cousins, who were known as the Viraduri. They had a different last name. And then you had the Mendez children. And the woman at the school, the administrator, said, we will take those children, meaning the cousins. And they were very light skinned and white passing. They said, but we won't take those, pointing to the Mexican children. And as you can see from this case, and from this photograph, the Mendez children were darker than their cousins. And so the auntie, the tia, did what tias do. And she was like, oh, no, you're not going to do this to us. And takes all the children and goes to tell Gonzalo, the father, what happened. And then this is where the father image comes in. And I call them fighting fathers. And so the father comes in and ends up going and, appeals to the school board, appeals to the school board, goes all the way up the chain to only get rejected. And he ends up finding out that there was a case that was argued about separate swimming pools for Mexicans and white people there in California. And there was an attorney that successfully sued so that Mexican Americans can use the pool at any time. And so he ended up getting that attorney to be able to represent him. And not only did they get the Mendez family, they ended up recruiting 5,000 families from all across the area to fight about that. And that was a tremendous, accomplishment to be able to do that. And the Mendez family, they were, they were farmers. There was a Japanese American family that owned a farm right around this time, and they were taken away to the relocation or the concentration camps that happened around World War II, and they needed and wanted somebody to help take over their farm. Otherwise, it would have been taken by eminent domain by the white government. And so one of the things that was interesting about Mexican Americans at the time is that they were actually legally white, but they were socially brown. So while they had the legal status of being white, they still were treated as second-class citizens and being segregated socially. So the Mendez family took over of the farm at the time and ended up, and so that's why she was in a totally different district when she was there. And that's how they were also able to recruit family, because then they had the resources to be able to do this. So this is another middle-class family that was a part of that. And so the Mendez case ends up going forward, and of course they end up winning the case, which was a tremendous victory, and a victory that said that separate is not equal. Now, I want you to remember that, because this is 1947. Several years before 1954 Brown. And this was what's really fascinating, is that in this case, they could not allege racial discrimination because they were legally white. So white people can't discriminate against white people. And so the attorney was brilliant enough to say, no, they're not discriminating on the basis of race. They're discriminating on the base of national identity. And so the fact that they're Mexican. And it was really interesting to listen to how, when you read the court trial transcripts, how much they couldn't talk about Mexicans without talking about race. They talked about it in a very racial way. And so, the attorneys didn't know how to talk about this in a non-racial way because the attorney for the Mendez family kept insisting to not talk about race. But because of that, the Mendez case is often cast as saying that they were trying to distance themselves from African Americans, which was completely not happening at the time. In fact, the NAACP met with David Marcus, that's the attorney, met with David Marcus during this time. And the Brown case is often credited with using social science to make their argument. The family called the Clark scholars who did this study, this black Dow study, this black Dow, white Dow study that they did. And they ended up, testifying in the case. And they said, well, that's the first time it's ever been used. Well, that's not really true. The first time was actually the Mendez case. The Mendez case relied on anthropologists and education scholars to be able to talk about the effects that segregation had on Mexican children at the time. And so the NAACP met with David Marcus and said, we want to use your skeleton for our cases because we like the way that you're doing it. And so they ended up being able to really talk about that. Now, what happened is that the Mendez case ended up getting appealed to the Ninth Circuit. And the Ninth Circuit is just below the Supreme Court, right? Just below. And they end up winning at the Ninth Circuit. Now, had they appealed again, this would have become the Supreme Court case on school desegregation in the US. However, what happened at the time is the governor of California ended up integrating the schools. And so the point became moot to why continue the lawsuit if they make separate schools illegal in California. And so what's really fascinating is that the governor at the time was Earl Warren, right? And for those of you who are not, Supreme Court nerds, Governor Earl Warren ends up becoming Chief Justice Earl Warren of the Supreme Court of the United States. And you will never guess what his first case was as the Chief Justice. It's Brown versus Board of Education. And so the Mendez family had a tremendous impact on Brown. And those are some beautiful connections between Black and Brown that I really, truly love to be able to point out. And I've had the honor of meeting Sylvia Mendez. Sylvia Mendez is still very much alive and kicking. She used to be able to go around the country and speak, and she can't do it as much anymore. And I had the honor of meeting her twice so far. And I remember I even, wished her a happy birthday. And she responded back to me in the comment section on Facebook, and I just got so excited. And she promoted my book, and it was such an honor to be able to do this. And I often tell people, I'm not telling their stories here. I'm sharing their stories. And so I want to close out by showing the poem that I share in the beginning of the book. It's by Langston Hughes, one of my favorite poets, and it's I Too Sing America. It says here, one moment. It says, I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes, and nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. And these cases for me represent people trying to get a seat at the table and being told to go to the kitchen and fighting for a seat at the table. And that this beautiful, beautiful family, these beautiful, beautiful young women who represent the fight, I call them my pretty little plaintiffs that represent this incredible fight to be able to say that I too am America and be able to say that they are beautiful and deserve to be part of history, part of society, and to be treated as absolute equals. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm open for question and answers. So thank you for the opportunity to share it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez Cola. That was a wonderful presentation. And we have a number of guests with us, San Antonio, Houston, Atlanta. I know I'm forgetting some people, but thank you so much to all of you for being with us. We do have a few questions, and I also just want to remind people, if you do have a question, go ahead and put that in the chat. First question, some folks were asking about how long do these types of cases last? In particular, a question was about the Tate family's legislation. But on a related note, how were they paying for these lawsuits?
Yes, no, those are great, great questions. Yes, well, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that the wheels of justice are very slow. And so many of these cases took anywhere from a year to 2 years to be completed. And so that's one of the things that happened in the Black Civil Rights Movement, that a lot of the young people got frustrated with the NAACP's, strategy of going through the law because it was just moving too slowly. But so up until that point, that was the way to fight these battles, was in the court of law. And so they often took several years. So the case really started for the Tate family in about 1883, roughly, and the decision came out 1883, 1884, and the decision came out in 1885. And you ask a wonderful question about how were these cases paid for. This is one of the things that I share in the book, is that, when we talk about intersection, we can't look at them as just racial cases. These are also about class. These families were all mostly middle-class families that could afford to file a lawsuit. And they were also, many of them, entrepreneurs. They had their own businesses, so they couldn't be threatened to be fired. There were other plaintiffs that were part of the case that they were often told, if you do this case, we're going to get you fired from your job. Well, they're entrepreneurs. They own their own business. They're the boss. They can't fire themselves, And so to be able to have the time, effort, and energy to be able to file these cases is tremendous. And so many of them are also very middle-class families. Yeah, is what I call them. I call that part of one of the things that was really fascinating that I found was that they, that picture of, Sylvia Mendez in front of a piano. And I found out when I was researching the Tate case, Mamie Tate, the young girl, played piano. There was a reporter that talked about that. And of course, I said, well, let me just check for grins and giggles. Let me look. And Olivia, in the Brown case, she plays piano and wants to teach piano. And I often told them that, when I went to study the Piper case, I was like, if you ever hear a scream emanating from the West, it's because I found out she played piano too, but she didn't. That would have been absolutely perfect if she had. But I call that particular part piano, pigtails, pianos, and the politics of respectability that these families represented.
Yeah, so the piano is kind of a signifier of being middle class, that you have a piano in your home that you can be playing. Okay, here's a great question. Have you come across the Plyler v. Doe case in your research? This person is actually working on a documentary about it.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's great. Absolutely. That's definitely one of the cases that I, end up sort of identifying in chapter 2 that I talk about. And I don't go into depth, in those cases. I sort of just break down, how many cases of the 105, most of the cases were, of course, filed by Black families, and then you had 14 cases that were filed by non-Black families. And I just took out the 3, and I looked at race, class, gender, and age across them. And so one of the things I would recommend that you're working on the documentary is to be able to say, what was the role of age, in that particular case. But yeah, no, I am, familiar with Plyler v. Doe, but I'm unfortunately not an expert in it.
Yeah, I was fascinated by your map showing where you found all those cases, because just think about how much history there is for us to know. And it may be that some of those cases are more interesting than others, but I also think it's so heartening to recognize that so many families were not just going to let this slide.
Yes, absolutely. You just gave me chills by saying that. These were all fighting families. And this wasn't a battle that was fought just in 1954. This, as I said, it started in 1849. So this is a fight that was over 100 years old. And so that's why I named my book The Bricks Before Brown, because these cases are the bricks that help lay the path to Brown. in order for Brown to even exist. So, yeah.
Right. Amazing history. I want to make sure everybody has a chance to put in your question. We do have a couple more minutes. We have somebody here with us who attended the Wellhausen School. That's in Cotulla, right? I don't know if you're familiar with this, Dr. Martinez-Cola, but our president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, as a college student, taught at a segregated Mexican school in South Texas, called the Wellhausen School. And we have somebody joining us who attended that school.
Yes.
And just a little bit of a segue, actually. Our August MACRI talk, let me just stick this graphic up for you. And our August MACRI talk, save the date, please. It will be Thursday, August 27th, which is actually LBJ's birthday. We'll be joined by Dr. Geraldo Cadava to talk about LBJ, Mexican Americans, and the border. So save the date for that. That'll be virtual. So just like we're joining here tonight, you can find it on Facebook or YouTube. But there's this long history, whether we're talking about California, whether we're talking about even out in sugar beet country, of segregated schools for Mexicans and other ethnic groups, all the way, of course, over to Texas, and then the better well-known segregated schools for African Americans across the American South, including Texas. Yeah. Yeah, so much history there. So much history.
There really is. And one of the things that in doing the research, I only identified in the book 2 Mexican American cases, but there are actually 5 really big main ones that happened. One in Texas, Hernandez case. There's one in Arizona, that's the Gonzalez case, and there are 3 in California. So you have Arizona, California, and Texas. They're part there. And so I encourage you to, I talk about the different bricks, and I call them, the Mexican American bricks, but I only talk about 2 of them there. But I really encourage you to go and see, I've written a few more articles since then to include those last 3 cases. And so, I encourage you to go and look up that rich, beautiful history. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you joining us tonight with this, because I think, MACRI, we focus on the history of Mexican American civil rights, but it's always important for us to remember that Mexican Americans don't exist in a vacuum, and our struggles are shared by a lot of other people. So we need to know those histories of Native Americans who are, in many cases our cousins or maybe even us. And also we need to know those struggles of Asian Americans and of course, African Americans. And so, I really appreciate that you package this in a way to show this isn't just any one group that experiences. This is a lot of Americans who experience this. Really important.
Absolutely. And I get the honor and privilege. I tell people, and I'm sorry if I've said this before, but I'm not telling their stories. They tell their own stories. I just have the honor of sharing it.
One last question I see. Where can you go in Big Pine to see the Piper statue?
Oh, that's great. So Big Pine is a very, very small town. So if you literally go down the main road, there's the school is very prominent. It's a big white building. And the statue is right in front of it. And so I really encourage you. It's also north, which I find really fascinating, of the, is it Manzanilla concentration camp for Japanese Americans?
Yeah,
so it's just north of that. And so I remember when I was at Utah State, one of the things I was trying to create was a multicultural civil rights tour for the students. And I was going to include Big Pine and the, that issue and stuff like that, and just kind of go around and the country do that.
Yeah,
and by the way, they are working on a statue for the Gonzalez family. I said that the Piper case is one of the few, if not the only, but now there is a statue as well that should be happening.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you for that question about Big Pine, because as the commenter mentioned it, that Manzanar is close to Big Pine. So Manzanar is where one of the Japanese internment camps during World War II. And of course, the Sylvia Mendez case actually has a connection to that, because the family was part, what were they? They were living in a house that was connected to a farm that was owned by Japanese Americans who were then interned. And luckily they had tenants who were willing to keep things up while they were gone, because so many of those Japanese American families lost everything.
Lost everything.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Oh, we've got some people who are cheering on the idea of a multicultural civil rights tour. So yes, that's gotta be something. We've got to think about that, how we can make that happen in the future.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I thank everybody for joining us tonight. It's always wonderful to be with scholars who can help us better understand how we fit into the big picture of the story of America. And appreciate all of the folks who joined us tonight. I mentioned we've got a new virtual talk coming up in August that will be about LBJ and Mexican Americans. We've also got an in-person event for those of you in San Antonio, Saturday, July 25th. We're doing a history harvest specifically about the Almeida Theater. So those of you from South Texas may know the Almeida Theater was a Spanish language movie palace here in San Antonio. During the era of segregation, downtown San Antonio was segregated. This was a Spanish language movie palace, and we're collecting stories about that on the 25th. We've always got something on the calendar here at MACRI. I encourage you to go to somosmacri.org. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can see our events calendar. You can make a donation. We appreciate you, and we want to help the public know more about Mexican American civil rights history. We are a national organization. I saw somebody in the chat asking if there was a MACRI in California. There's not a MACRI in California. We are a national organization. We would love to come and do an event in California. We are headquartered in San Antonio, but we cover stories all over the country about Mexican American civil rights history. Thank you again, Dr. Martinez-Cola, for being with us tonight. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. We hope to see you at a future MACRI event another day. And also, if you're in Texas, it's flooding right now. Be safe. And good night to everyone.
Goodbye.